it's a real honour to be here this evening. It's a privilege as well to be here to talk to you about the work that I've been doing at High Hayes. It's a great privilege as well to be able to talk to you about the work that Emma, my late wife, as Anne outlined there, who gave so much of her time and her energy to this society. It's obviously it's a bit poignant here this evening because Emma isn't here. A book has been published on the excavations at High Hayes, and it's sad that she didn't see it through to publication. The site that I'm going to talk to you about, it was one of the most important excavations that Emma did in her lifetime, and it's significant for medieval archaeology, it's significant for the history of Kilkenny, it's significant for the study of ceramics in Ireland, the technology of the potters in this country. And just before I talk to you about the site, just to talk to you a little bit about Emma and her work here in Kilkenny Archaeological Society and in Roth House. Many of you here will remember Emma, and it's lovely to see so many of her friends here, and it's lovely to see so many people from the Kilkenny Archaeological Society here who she held really, really dear in her heart for such a long time. She was a member of the council of the society. She worked on as the curator of the society here for many years. This lovely medieval beam here was conserved and restored and mounted here thanks to the work of Emma, and she worked in conjunction with a man called Sven Habermann, who's a specialist in timber conservation. And if beams could talk, I remember distinctly the two of them trying to get that beam, which weighs about, I don't know, it must weigh a ton, I think. Getting that beam up there was quite a job, and that beam heard lots of new words, I'm sure that so it's really, it's a great privilege really to be here this evening, and thank you very much for coming along. Emma gave a talk on the excavation that she and I undertook at High Hayes. The excavation was carried out in 2006, and Emma actually spoke to the society here in, I think it was 2007 or 2008. She gave a talk on the kind of preliminary results of the archaeological excavation. She was really passionate about this particular site, and for all sorts of reasons, for the wonderful team that we had on the excavation, and Sinead is here, and I think there's James here as well from the dig, and Jimmy, of course, and we had a wonderful team. It was a really challenging excavation logistically, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but the archaeology that we found on the site was extraordinary. It was completely unexpected. For one, we never knew that there was this medieval industrial zone, if you want to put it like that, that had ever existed. It had never been written about in any of the recorded sources. It was a complete bolt out of the blue, and then so much of the area had been developed through the railway station and various other things over the years. Roads had been cut through it, so it was amazing really that this little pocket of archaeology that told us so much about the medieval past that it even survived. So before Emma died in 2012, she had finished the kind of technical reports on the excavation, So she had written up the stratigraphy, as we call it, which is basically an account of what we found on the excavation. And we had done a lot of work on the pottery that had been found. And the next thing then was to bring it to the next stage, which was publication. Now, anyone who's published anything on archaeology will know that it's a very time-consuming and painstaking process, and it's fantastic that at long last, after what was 16, 17 years after the excavation, that the book has finally been published. There it is, and I'm really, really happy with it, and it's great for Emma's legacy. It's great for, if you don't mind me saying, it's great for for our understanding of the archaeology of Kilkenny as well. And in terms of the our understanding of pottery production in medieval Ireland, it's a key text now for anyone who wants to study or understand that part of our past. It's the first comprehensive study of the making and the marketing of pottery in medieval Ireland. So that's kind of the background to what I'm going to speak to you about this evening. There's copies of it if anyone wants them. They're in the book centre, and you can get it online as well on Oxbow Books there. So pottery it's a key tool that archaeologists use, and it's used for dating. It gives us an understanding of how people consumed food, how they cooked food in the past, and it has all sorts of uses like that. But one of the extraordinary things about Ireland is that for about 2,000 years, from the end of the Bronze Age, this is some Bronze Age pottery that was discovered. Do any of you recognise this here? Yeah, it's Danes Fort. It's the Anglo-Norman ringwork, earth and timber castle just outside Danes Fort, with the 18th century folly on top of it. And when this was being dug into in the 19th century by the Wims family, I think, they came upon these beautiful Bronze Age vessels. But this was some of the very last pottery. There's a whole big tradition. So there's pottery being made in the Neolithic period. There's pottery being produced here and throughout Ireland in the Bronze Age. We get lovely stuff like this. But then it stops. There's virtually none in the Iron Age. There's little bits of it in the early medieval period. And it's not until the Anglo-Norman conquest that pottery comes back into use. And so for that great big span of time, for 2,000 odd years, there's virtually no pottery being produced here in Ireland. And instead, people are using organic materials for they don't need it, basically. So this is the famous 16th century derrick wood cut that shows the McSweeney's feasting here, and you've got the famous bradors there. They're doing their farting at the feast. But if you look at all the vessels, these are all these lovely wood turned plates, and that's even, you can see the jug here, and it's of timber. It's a stave built jug. So there's some in the excavations in Waterford, for example, they found about 50 or 60 of these lathe turned plates from the Viking levels there. So pottery is pretty much an alien thing for a vast span of time, from the Bronze Age until the Anglo-Normans. And then with the Anglo-Norman invasion, pottery is such a key part of the, the Norman identity. It's part of their drinking culture. You can see here this lovely illustration here from a manuscript of a very typical Anglo-Norman feast scene. And what are they pouring the wine out of? A lovely ceramic jug here, and so forth. So another ceramic jug here, I think maybe it's metal, but so with the Normans, because it's such an important part of their identity, part of their culture, they need pottery, and they need it for their tablewares, they need it for cooking wares, and because there's no pottery here at the time, they have to import it. So they import lots and lots of pottery from the western England, mostly from Wales. Then they import pottery as well. Initially, at the beginning of the conquest, they bring it with them, and they import it from the Bordeaux region in France mostly. But then they need pottery here to be produced here as well. So they bring potters. They bring potters over from the Anglo-Norman world, and they set up their kilns here, and you get this, for the first time in about 2,000 years, you get this enormous amount of ceramic production here in the Anglo-Norman colony on the island of Ireland. And it's the closest thing really that we have to the kind of industrial scale production, from that period. Like there's a site there in Drogheda in County Louth that was excavated about 20 odd years ago. It was a pottery production centre. There was about 7 or 8 kilns found on it, and a couple of workshops. And the archaeologists there found 670,000 sherds of pottery. This is all the material, the waste material that hadn't been sold off, and it's an extraordinary amount of pottery. And that was just the stuff that was left behind in the kiln sites. So you've got this mass production taking place here from the late 12th century. But this only happens for about 200 years. Mm-hmm. And suddenly there's virtually no pottery again. And production goes right down to a complete trickle. There's none of this large scale pottery production that we find in the 13th and 14th century. And it's not really until, I suppose, the 18th century then that you get ceramic production suddenly taken off again. And it's come at that time. There's a lot of local kilns. The Wansfords out in Castlecomer set up some of the very earliest kilns in the post-medieval period, after to kind of restart the whole industry again. So there's really interesting study to be done on identifying precisely the wares that were being produced in the Wansford kilns. They're well documented, and they were exploiting the cold seam clays out in Castlecomer, and but nobody's ever really looked at exactly what they were producing. So that's for another day. So that's pottery. It's ubiquitous in the Anglo-Norman world, but it's not so common in the Gaelic world outside of the colony. So there's a little bit of when Gaelic sites are excavated, there tends to be a small amount of pottery is found, but in the main it is the Anglo-Norman colony is where you find it. So Kilkenny, being at the heart of the Norman colony, is chock-a-block with the pottery. Every single person, every dwelling, every house, every garden is full of it. When we excavated here on 3 or 4 occasions, virtually every 4th or 5th shovelful that you'd dig up, there would be Norman pottery in it. And including just outside the door there, we excavated the, I'll show you a slide of it in a second, but we excavated a lovely stone-lined cesspit that belonged to the abbot of Dusgaby in Graignamanagh, and this, before Roth House was built, his townhouse sat on this site, and his cesspit was just outside the door there. We excavated that, and it was full of all this absolutely beautiful Saintonge polychrome ware, which is really high-end, high-status tablewares that would have been kind of a centrepiece of the dining table in the abbot's townhouse here. And remember now, he's the fellow who's supposed to be a vegetarian, and he's supposed to be abstaining from all these things, but he seems to have been coming up here and having a wine. We also, as well as the wine jugs, we found that he was eating the finest cuts of beef and pork and roast swan and all this sort of stuff. So so exactly. We've known for a long time that all of this pottery was being produced in Ireland. We've known that the Normans were importing a lot of pottery. We've known very, very, very little about exactly how it was being produced, where it was being produced, and the kind of processes that took a raw piece of clay to something like that there, these lovely jugs, jars. So the processes from sourcing the clay, treating the clay, mixing it with all sorts of different things, throwing the pots, then firing the pots, glazing them, and then marketing them off to the townhouse place like this in the 13th to 14th century. So that whole kind of sequence was very, very, very little was understood about exactly how all that worked. And that was because there was a complete lack of production sites being found. There's only been 7 production sites excavated in Ireland, and High Hayes is one of them. So what was so important about High Hayes really was that it wasn't just the kilns that were found. In most other sites, bar Drogheda and one a rural pottery production site in a place called Carraray in County Wexford, it's just been the kilns that have been found. So all of the kind of workshops and the extraction pits and all that sort of ancillary stuff that actually tells you how the pottery was being produced, they've been missing from everywhere bar those sites. And that's what's so important about High Hayes, is the fact that the workshops and everything else did survive there. So where are we talking about? Many of you will know it's just on the edge of Kilkenny. You go down John Street and there's the car park there, where there's there's a planning application in for a hotel there. Now that's the reason we excavated there in the first place, actually, was because it was proposed to put a hotel in there as part of the wider McDonagh Junction shopping centre development, and the hotel never got built, but there's a new planning application in for it. So that was the reason we excavated there in the first place, and that's it today. You'll know it there. You go up the Dublin Road and it's just on your left hand side. So the pottery kiln that we found was just about there, just beside that sign, the yield sign. That was where the pottery kiln was, and then all of the other ancillary stuff, the workshops and so forth, kind of stretched where all the cars are there. And there's still a little bit of the site that we didn't excavate. Can you see it there? There's a bank of clay there that's still left, and that'll have to be dealt with now if they're building this hotel. Yeah, it's at the entrance into the railway station. Then was the continuation of the site up here, and we excavated in this green area here as well. And any of you that have had to struggle up this big steep hill there with your bags trying to run to get the train or whatever, well, you can all just curse me, I think, mostly, because the reason that hill is so steep is to preserve a big section of the site that we left unexcavated, and that's still under there. So originally the plan was that the hill would be at a much kind of more kind gradient, but in order to allow us to preserve some of the archaeology, they changed the design of it a little bit and it made the hill a bit steeper, so that's all my fault. The name of the townland itself then, High Hayes, is interesting in its own right. It means the haze is an old English word for a meadow, so it's the high meadow. And if you've ever stood up there, you'll know that there's a lovely view over the suburb of St. John's and over to the castle, and even when you come out of the railway station, there's that absolutely fabulous view towards the castle and the cathedral, which is really a very, very important view that needs to be protected. So it was the high meadow. So there was a meadow there. That particular townland name, the earliest reference I can find to it occurs in the 17th century. So at that time, it was the high meadow, and we know that outside the town walls, there was sort of a ring of these meadows and gardens that were being used by the burgesses, like the Rotes here and so forth, of the medieval and early modern town. If you look at this map here, you'll see there's the excavation site, there's the town wall of St. John's. So it's about 200 metres outside the town wall, and there's the Augustinian Priory of St. John's. And so this was a suburb that developed in the 13th century between the river here and our site up here at High Hayes. It's very, very well situated as well, because it's right beside the fair green of the medieval town, and this was where the main fair was held 2 times a year. This was probably the 2 biggest economic events of the medieval year were held right here at the fair green. And where better to set up your pottery production site where you can sell all your stuff, but right beside the fair green. And also you've got a very, very wealthy clientele just here in the medieval town, within the walls and in the suburbs around it. And you've got the people in the butlers in the castle, and you've got, the very wealthy burgesses living in the Burgerplatz inside in the town. So really it couldn't be sited at a better location to take advantage of all of the economic opportunities that the 13th century and 14th century town gave the potters. And I suppose you have to realise as well, at the time High Hayes was in production in the early 14th century, Kilkenny really was a boom town, absolute boom town. It had been for about 50 years running up. From the mid 13th century onwards, it is boom town here, and it is Ireland's largest inland town. You've got the castle, and you've got then a whole series of towns down along the River Nore that are linked then to the international port that William Marshall had established at New Ross. So there's this one big economic corridor centred on the River Nore, with Kilkenny at the apex, and it is boom time here for the Anglo-Normans. So this was probably a no-brainer for our potters here. This is you've got a ready market for the pottery, and there's another map of it here, just a close up, just shows you again just outside. Like I mentioned earlier on, we didn't know that there was a suburb here before we started here, and there was archaeological assessments done, and nobody really guessed, I suppose, that this could be an archaeologically sensitive area. But the National Monument Service, who I work for now, in their wisdom, despite that, they put on an archaeological monitoring condition on the entire development here. And that meant that there was archaeologists looking at the construction works and all the groundworks and the excavations that were happening to make way for the new shopping centre development. So that's back in 2006, and many of you will have heard of there's just a picture of it all in full swing. Our site is this area here. There's the Dublin Road here. That was the main focus of our site. There's the pottery kiln is just here. Many of you will have heard of the famine graveyard that was excavated here. That was just here at the back of the development, and that was discovered in 2006 during that monitoring, and that was quite a moment. That was Halloween 2006, and I'm standing there, and suddenly there's all these burials and bones everywhere, and so that was subsequently excavated by Brenda O'Mara and Margaret Gowan, and resulted in the discovery of the workhouse burial ground. So 1,000 souls were interred in 63 mass graves in a very, very short period of time at the back of the site there, probably between 1847 and 1849, if memory serves. So really, it's a material witness to the catastrophe of the Great Famine, and it has been published, and the most amazing osteoarchaeological analysis has been done on the excavated skeletal assemblage there by Johnny Geber, and he's published this brilliant book that many of you will know, and if you haven't read it, it's absolutely essential reading for an understanding of Kilkenny at the time, and also for the realities, I suppose, of the Great Famine. Back to our site then, at the other side of the development. So we're here, okay, the burial ground is down here, there's the Dublin Road, and in a January night, I think, was it 1 o'clock in the morning or something?
Like
9 or 10, okay, I'm exaggerating. In January night 2006, Sinead Marshall there was monitoring away, and I think that they were digging a pipe trench just along the Dublin Road around here, and suddenly all of this pottery turned up, and there was pits full of this pottery, and Sinead stopped everything, and we went in, investigated the site, and it became apparent pretty quickly that we were dealing with a really, really important archaeological site here. So what we did was this is where Sinead found the pits with the pottery. We extended the area here, and suddenly we found the pottery kiln. And then we kept opening up wider and wider areas, and the archaeology just kept going. As you go up the hill here, it just kept extending, and suddenly there was buildings, there was loads of pits. There was about 120 of these big pits that were absolutely chock-a-block with pottery. And then there was big dumps of pottery. There was another drying kiln over here, and then we opened up this area over here as well, which is where I was showing you the hill going up to the railway station, and again more archaeology over here. So there was these two main areas here, and this was the pottery production centre, and then over here I think what we found was like a bake yard, and they're both from exactly the same period of time. Now, because you can see in these pictures here, it gives you a sense of, I suppose, the sort of environment in which we had to work, and it was from a logistical point of view, it was a bit of a nightmare, to be honest with you, because we were in the middle of a really, really busy, massive construction site. I mean, I think this is probably the biggest development that had happened in Kilkenny and Yonks. So you had the diggers going full blast, and you had the fumes and the builders roaring at you to get out of the way and all the rest of it the whole time. So the way we had to excavate it was we had to do it in strips, and that was to kind of allow the archaeology to be dealt with first, and then once the strip had been cleared of archaeology, as the developers would see it, they were allowed in there then, and they could build away. Okay, so at the end of that process then, so we excavated it all in a whole series of strips, and at the end of that process we had to kind of click it all back together again, and that was in its no mean feat in itself as well. And it was really, we were blessed with an amazing archaeological team, and we also had a really amazing archaeological surveyor on the site, and I have to pay credit to the late Phelan Manning, who sadly passed away there a few years ago, who was one of the core people on the team here, and his surveying and his drawings, which are works of art in their own right, he did amazing work, but it's because of his surveying that we were able to do that, to kind of put it all back together again after we came off the site. So the kiln, first of all, there's the kiln there, right at the bottom of the site, the Dublin Road. The kiln itself had been cut through in the 1960s by a pipe trench, and you can see, so that's all that was left of it. And you can see there's the chamber of the kiln here, and it's got these lovely little bricks. These are things called fire bricks, and I'll talk to you about them again in a second. So that's the main chamber of the kiln where the pots were fired, and then on either side of the main chamber you had stoke pits where the fuel, the timber, was placed and put on fire, burnt, and the heat then from that was drawn into the main chamber, which was covered over, and that's where the pots were fired. And so it's, for any pottery kiln nerds out there, this is a type 2C pottery kiln, and it's identical to most of the other kilns that have been excavated on the island of Ireland. It's the pretty standard Anglo-Norman, late 13th, early 14th century setup for a pottery kiln. And then this is a reconstruction then of how it would have functioned and how it would have worked originally back at the time of production. So there's the main chamber, the firing chamber of the kiln, and it's covered over with a dome of clay and wattle. And that, we know that how it was constructed, because when the place was abandoned, this collapsed into the chamber, and it left lots and lots of the little twigs from the wattle, and it left some of the chunks of the clay daub as well. So this was a temporary structure that was built over the main chamber. There was a little chimney left in it up here at the top, and the archaeobotanical analysis that was done on this by Mary Dillon and Inga-Lisa Stutz, it told us an awful lot about how the thing was structured. So basically it was like an upturned basket of willow and hazel, and then it was covered with a layer of wet clay, and then that would have been fired and hardened. And that created then the environment for the firing of the pots. And then there's the fire bricks that I was telling you about. So they were all sitting in the firing chamber here, and we also recovered a good few of them from the waste pits in the area as well. And when you put them all together, they kind of formed this sort of spider's leg arrangement around the central pedestal here. So you had a stone pedestal here in the middle, and then you had this kind of spider's leg arrangement of these fire bricks coming out from it, and that's what we've shown here. And the idea there is that they create sort of raised floor inside in the firing chamber, so that the heat from the stoke pits here is sort of drawn in, and it goes up and under, and it fires the pots. Lovely.
What height would that have been?
What did you say, about 1.5 meters or so, maybe 2 meters high, something like that, I think. Yeah. And then, so you've got the stoke pits here. This is, you can see here in the reconstruction, you've got your fuel here. We actually got a lovely stand beside the kiln where the fuel would have been stored. It was like a little cobbled area where the timber would have been stored. And then it's burnt in the stoke pits here. And then these are the flues here. So we got some of the stones that would have formed the flues. And then I'm going to be talking to you a bit about there's a very, very particular type of ceramic production going on here. And it's a thing called reduced ware. So, you know, a lot of pottery is orange. You'd see it at earthenware pottery, and it's got this lovely orange colour. Well, that's not what they wanted here. What they wanted to produce here was a type of pottery which had a very, very fine fabric and which fired to kind of an off-white colour and a grey colour. A very, very hard, well-fired product. And to achieve that, you needed a reduced environment within the firing chamber in here. And the way to achieve that was you blocked out any oxygen from the firing chamber. And so once the kiln was fired, they would block up then the flues here and block off the chimney here as well. And we actually found one of the blocking stones was still in the flue, I think over here, yeah. That stone there was still actually lodged inside in the flue to block it off. And that created then this zero oxygen environment inside in the chamber, and that created the reduced ware pottery, which is what they wanted here. And they wanted that for a very, very particular reason that I'll get to in a second. So it's a pretty, it looks on the ground like it's just a couple of holes in the ground, but what they were at here was a very kind of complex, technologically advanced form of pottery production. We found out a little bit about the fuel as well that was being used, mostly through the work of Ingelisa and Mary, on charcoal that was left inside in the chamber here. And that told us that the potters were going out into the forests that would have surrounded the city, and they were taking, a lot of the timber was being taken from the forest floor, and it was being lopped off the trees to a lesser extent. So most of the timber that was being used, it wasn't the high quality oak and kind of the likes of this. They wouldn't have been able to touch that because this was expensive stuff. What they were after, and what they were only allowed, I presume, to obtain to fire the kilns here would have been the sort of stuff that they could gather off the forest floor, and the more expensive oak beams and logs and things like that would have been purely for the preserve of the wealthy in the medieval town. So they were firing willow, alder, a bit of oak, and yeah, I think that they were the main ones if memory serves. So it gives us a nice little window into the potters heading out into the forests, and they're getting the stuff off the forest floor. So what we did, once we had excavated the interior of the kiln, we were left with, can you see there's this lovely orange band, I suppose, around the side of the firing chamber. And what we did then was we took loads and loads of samples of that. We took 62 samples of that in these little blocks, and on the top of each sample we had to mark out where exactly magnetic north was that particular time. The reason we did this, we weren't just having a laugh, we were trying to, there's a scientific dating technique called archaeomagnetic dating. It's really, really good for giving us dates on burnt features. So if something is heavily burnt, it leaves this kind of orange rubification, as it's called, in the clay. And it's based on the principle, basically, that magnetic north is constantly changing, would you believe? So in the 10th century AD, it was over here. In the 13th century, it was here. And in 2023, it's here. Okay, so when you look at your compass, that's where it is now. But back in the 13th century, it was different. Okay, so it's changing all the time, the direction of magnetic north. And this amazing thing happens when clay is fired to a very, very high temperature. It preserves in it exactly where magnetic north was at that particular time. And scientists have worked out, you know, where exactly it was at that particular time. So we take the samples, they go off to a lab, the archaeomagnetic scientists tell us, okay, well, at the time that this was fired, magnetic north was over here, and that can only have been between 1325 and 1375 AD. So it gives us a really nice time span in which the kiln was fired. But we were able to go one step further because we had taken so many samples. We were able to do this statistical analysis, I think called bootstrap analysis or something, and it's basically where you could do a statistical analysis of them all, and the most likely date, the most probable date for the final firing of the kiln, we were able to get it down to 1 year, and that's the year 1336 AD. So the archaeomagnetic dating is fabulous when it works right. It can really get you very, very close, precise dates, and much, much closer than things like radiocarbon dating. And it's, you know, it's only equalled really by dendrochronology, which is only available if you've got the timber, you know. So that's a really, really useful chronological marker. It tells us when the kiln was finally fired, and it's really useful then. So for other archaeologists, when they find the pottery that was being produced here, if you find that on your site, you know, you can say, well, we know that this pottery was being produced in this time span. Okay, and it's a very, very, very useful tool. So High Hayes, it's one of only 6 of these pottery making. It's the 7th of these pottery making sites to have been excavated on the island of Ireland. Within them, there's 17 kilns have been excavated, and you can see they're all pretty much of the same type as the High Hayes one. There's our one up there, and these are some of the Drogheda ones. There's Downpatrick, and there's the old Mart site in Drogheda, Carrickfergus, then another one. So they're all pretty much, they've got central firing chamber, stoke pits on either side, and they're using the same type 2C technology to fire their pots. There's a picture of one of the ones in Drogheda that has been excavated, exactly the same as the one in High Hayes, but much better preserved, as you can see. That a pipe hadn't run through it in the 60s. So there's the central pedestal here, your stoke pit, and a firing chamber here. And they had the same sorts of these fire bricks as well were in use in Drogheda. You can see them there, in the sort of spider leg pattern. And like I said to you, just, you know, well over 500,000 pottery shards were found on that site, and there are some of them there. So, but the amazing thing, as I've alluded to already, about the High Hayes site is that it wasn't just the kiln that was found. Drogheda and Carraray in County Wexford are the only other 2 Irish sites that have produced all of the stuff that was happening outside of the kilns themselves. And even in England, there's only a handful of these sites where you've got the full production area represented in the archaeology. And the same you go to Europe, there's very, very few of these complete production centres. So that's one of the reasons why Hay is so important. So we found 2 workshop buildings, one here, small little one, the foundations of them. There's the foundations of this, that's what you're looking at here, that corner there. So this was a big, long building with a very, very characteristic wide open area on the east side of it here. And if you look at illustrations from the medieval period of potters at work, they're invariably in these big, long, open-sided buildings. That's where their workshops are. So there's a potter there on a kick wheel, and or on a cart wheel, sorry, pottery turner there, and he's so. And this one here, they're all open-sided, and I'm pretty sure that's what we have here. So we've got the workshop here, and then another workshop building here, and then right beside that then there was a clay store. So this was a little rectangular building, and this is it before it was excavated, and you can see there's a big dump of raw clay up against being stored inside in the building. So this was the raw clay that was being used for throwing the pots, and this is it after it was excavated. So that's just there. Just outside that then we had a whole series of things called fire spots. So they're little hearts. There's a whole row of them, and we think that they were used for producing the glazes for the pottery. So it melt down copper and various other things to make the glazes. Over here there was a drying kiln. It was very like a corn drying kiln, the typical corn drying kilns that you get of this period. But the thing about this one was when we analysed it, there was no evidence that it had actually been ever used for drying of cereals. So we think that this may have formed part of the production process, so that the pots were dried in this kiln, and then they were put into the actual pottery kiln itself then, where they were fired over here. And then up here we had a whole series of cesspits, and I'll talk to you about them in a minute. And then down the bottom of the site were about 120 of these big massive pits that were where the sand and the gravel was being extracted, and it was being mixed up with the clay. And over here there was some very distinctive kind of rectangular pits, holes in the ground, where a thing called levigation was taking place. And this is where the raw clay is taken from the clay store here, where it's been where it's been weathered, and it's allowed to kind of break down, and it's put into these levigation pits here, mixed with water, and that allows all the coarse stuff to go down to the bottom, and then they're taken out, and the clay is then mixed up again to make pottery clay. The cess pits themselves then, there's a picture of them there. That's one that's kind of half, you can see there's a section through it. So these are big, deep pits in the ground, and they were full of really interesting information in archaeobotanical remains, and we found lots of food remains that the potter would have. It tells us an awful lot about what the potter was eating and so forth. But this is where the potters went to the toilet, basically. Okay. And we did on the cover of the book, and on the first slide I showed you there, we had we got a reconstruction painting done of it, and just that zooms in on. There's the fella there. He's going to the toilet. Philip Armstrong did the painting, and he asked me to send him a picture of myself because he wanted to put my face on your man going to the toilet there. So I think he's nothing like me, but anyway, there's something. Now, when we were excavating the cesspits, we kept finding these pieces of pottery where the edges had been kind of dulled on them, okay, where they had been made. See the way these are here, where they're kind of chipped, exactly, yeah, to take the sharp edges off them. And I've been scratching my head about these for ages. And I was looking there just actually quite recently. I was looking at some evidence from the Greek, the classical world, and you have these things called pessoi, which means pebbles in Greek, and they were pieces of pottery that were used for cleaning your bum. Yeah. And in the Greek world, people used to write curses on they'd write somebody's name on the piece of pottery, wipe their bum with it, and throw it into the pit, and these were called ostraces. So that's where the word to ostracize somebody comes from, because so. And there's a plate from about 500 BC of a Greek fella going to the toilet, and what's he holding in his hand? One of these things. And even today, there's ethnographic parallels for these. I've seen stuff. I've gone really deep into this now. So there's a place in Algeria where they still do this today. They still use pottery as toilet paper, and and there's other spots around the place as well. So this there's a whole archaeology of poo pottery to be done out there, and so yeah, I don't know if anyone's interested in an experimental archaeology project. Take a list at the door there. So beyond that, then moving swiftly on to the other side of the site, we've got the bake yard here. So over here we had an oven, a drying kiln. This was radiocarbon dated to the same period as the pottery kiln over here, and a lovely little oven. There's the drying kiln there. This was used for drying wet cereals so that it could be ground into corn in the Lord's Mill, which was just over the way down at the Modlin Mills down near Lacken there. So this was all part of the same suburban development, I suppose, this kind of industrial suburb of the medieval town. And that's the lovely reconstruction that Philip Armstrong and myself worked on. And you can see it really brings the whole thing to life. You're looking from that high ridge that gives High Hayes its name, over the medieval town here. Here's the suburb of St. John's. You've got the Augustinian Priory there with the famous great, the Lantern of Ireland it was called. And there's St. John's outer gate here, St. John's inner gate over here on the bridge, Kilkenny Castle, and that's the little tower on Modlin Street. That's that there. Yeah. And we've got the town wall then, which at this time in say 1330 was actually of timber. It was a timber palisade, it wasn't a stone wall at that time. And then you've got the suburb of High Hayes. Then there's the fairground over here. The fair is in full swing. The potter is here making his pottery in the kiln. There's the chimney at the top, and you can see the flames coming out. You've got the children here mixing the clay in the levigation pits, and then the workshop. We don't really know exactly where the pots were actually thrown, but from a guess, the smaller building probably is the most likely one. So there's the potter in there, and he's throwing, or maybe she was throwing the pots. And here's the storehouse then. So this is where the pots were left to dry. You've got the drying kiln here. There's me on the toilet. And the clay store over here. So it's a fabulous reconstruction. It just really kind of brings it all to life. We discovered about 9,000 artefacts in the excavations. Not surprisingly, most of this is pottery, the wasters, the stuff that wasn't sold, the material that was left behind after the site was abandoned. But as well as the pottery, they also found a number of really, really lovely medieval artefacts, including this fantastic little ear scoop. It's only about that size, and it's got a spoon on one side, a little twist here, and then a sharp picker here at the other side. Emma wrote an article about this and published it in the Old Kilkenny Review there back around 2008, I think, and it tells you everything you need to know about it. But what these were used for was, just as it shows here, they're used for taking the wax out of your ears. That's what the spoon is for, and then the other side of it is for taking the dirt from under your nails. Yeah. And apparently there was a fella in the medieval town whose job it was to do this. God help him. We also found a number of these lovely brooches. These are called ring brooches, and they are very, very typical of the 13th and 14th century, and they would have held the top of a cloak or a garment together like that at the very top. This one here has what looks like writing on it, and a lot of these ring brooches, they have little love messages and stuff like that on them, but this particular one, it's just made to look like it's got writing on it. It doesn't actually make any sense whatsoever, and it's bent like this, and it was thrown away, and I wonder was it given as a present to some medieval woman who wasn't impressed by the fact that he couldn't even bother to get a nice little message engraved on it, and she just crushed it and threw it away. But that's just... Also, I mentioned the glazes that were used in the pottery production earlier on. Now, a very large amount of copper objects were found in the excavation, and a lot of these were found by Jimmy there, who metal detected the spoil heaps for us back during the excavation. And I think a lot of these, like this buckle, this little shape for the bottom of a scabbard, things like that, would have been gathered up by the potter for melting down, and then using mixed up in the production of the glazes. So I reckon a lot of the copper ally objects found their way into the site through that. So to the pottery, what were they actually producing here? Products of the High Hayes Production Centre. It's called High Hayes Ware, W-A-R-E, and we found 6,500 shards of this particular ware in a whole series of different fabrics, from very, very coarse wares, which was used for the kind of utilitarian jars and the kitchen wares, to the really, really high-end fabrics that are the ones I was describing earlier on, the reduced ware fabrics, which are this lovely, lovely fine off-white and grey fabrics that was being used to produce things like this lovely jug here. And you can see there's the fabric for this particular jug here. You can see it's a really, really lovely off-white colour, and same with this one here. So 6,500 shards. Most of these are found in the waste or dumps in the pits and kind of scattered around the site. Most of the pottery that's been produced here is wheel thrown pottery. So it's not like this is a big advance in the Norman world, where they go from making the coil built, hand built pottery around the year 1200 or so. They go from that to wheel thrown pottery, and so virtually, about 75% of the High Hayes pottery is wheel thrown, but they're still using the old coil built for some, particularly some of the coarser wares, like the kitchen wares. So they're producing cooking pots, cooking jars, storage jars, jugs, and these little things down here, which are money boxes. Yeah, these are little money boxes. They're also producing ridge tiles for roofs. So at the very top of your roof, you have these lovely ceramic tiles which are used, and I'll show you those again in a second. But it's the jugs really that are at the pinnacle of the production output on the site. They're really high quality, wheel-thrown vessels. They've got this beautiful green glaze on them, that very distinctive white-grey fabric as well. And there's one of them here, lovely, very nice, kind of tall, slender jugs. This one here, particularly nice one, which was found in about 30 or 40 pieces, and it's been great fun clicking it all back together again. But you can see there's some of the fabric peeping out there, and it's this lovely grey fabric, and it's got these applied strips, which are in spiral strips, I suppose you call them, and the strap handle there. So this is the best stuff that they're producing at High Hayes. This is the kind of thing that would have stood as a centrepiece, as a talking piece on a medieval table, and it's very, very distinctive. So we didn't find any complete pots here on the site. Everything was in bits. It was all in pieces, and we had to spend an awful lot of time piecing things back together again to try and figure out what the forms were and the fabrics and so forth. But would you believe, by far the best preserved one of these jugs was actually discovered back in the 1960s by Nell Prendergast. No, Nell didn't discover it. It was discovered by a farmer who was digging a trench out at Castle Inch, near Inchilogan, as it used to be called, near a castle which no longer exists, as far as I know. I think there might be one wall of it left, and it was a Duval castle in the medieval period. So Duval is the Wall family, and he was digging a trench, and he came upon this perfectly preserved medieval wine jug, and this was produced at the High Hayes Kiln site, and this is now on display. It was written up, published by Nell in the Old Kilkenny Review, and it is now on display in the Phelan room over there, so in the Kilkenny Archaeological Society collection. So these were wine jugs. The wine jugs were probably the most significant of the outputs from the Kiln site, and you can see there's some medieval illustrations of him there. There's a monk, and he's testing the wine here, but he's got a lovely ceramic jug here, very, very like the one I just showed you from High Hayes. And here you've got again, there's a scene where she's pouring the wine into these are the jugs that would have been placed on the table. Now, our particular potter at High Hayes, they had their own very kind of distinctive signature, and that was this, which is this is the handle from a jug. And what they did when they finished off the handle was they put this lovely little sinuous line down along the length of the strap handle, and then these stab marks on either side. And High Hayes pottery is the only pottery that's been produced in medieval Ireland that has this particular form of strap handle. So where we find that particular motif, we know that's High Hayes ware. Okay, and it's very, very unique to our particular potter. So you have to kind of get back into his head and go, well, this guy he wants, or this woman, they want their ware to stand out, and what better way to do it than to sign it with your own particular little flourish like that, when you compare the pottery that's been produced at High Haze to what's been produced elsewhere in the Norman world at that time, there's two areas that are very, very closely comparable. One is in the Saintonge region of near Bordeaux, in Aquitaine, in France, where they're producing these big, long, slender jugs with that lovely white, off-white fabric, green glaze, very, very, very similar to what's being produced at High Haze. And then the other stuff that they're producing are these jugs that are in a grey fabric generally, and they're being produced in a place called Redcliffe, which is a suburb of Bristol in Western England. And there's a big pottery production industry in Redcliffe, and our potter is basically producing mimics or copies of both the Saintonge stuff and the Redcliffe. Now they're so what he's not producing though is the polychrome pottery that's coming out of the Saintonge, this beautiful stuff. This is the kind of pottery that we found in the abbot of Dousgaby's cesspit outside the door there, and he would have had these jugs on his, but these are from the Saintonge again. So he's not going to that length. But if you compare, this is a very famous pottery jug from High Street in Dublin, and this was produced in the Redcliffe potteries in Bristol, and you can see it's quite similar. It's got the same spirals, and this one here has got a monkey being chased around the rim of the jug by a knight. You can see in there. So very, very, very similar, and I'm pretty certain what our potter was trying to do was to basically produce copies of the Redcliffe and the Saintonge jugs, because these were sought after. These were the things that you wanted on your table to mark out your prestige and your status. What he was also producing were lots and lots of these cooking wares. So so you had the jugs, which is the high end. At the low end, then you had lots of jars and pots and things like this that would have been used for cooking. And we've got a lovely image here from the Luttrell Psalter, and it shows a cooking pot here. You see that just there, in a ceramic pot, which is identical to one of these. So these were multifunctional. They would have had all sorts of uses in cooking, storage, all that kind of thing. The money boxes then, good few of these money boxes were discovered, and these are two of the ones we found. Again, they're in the same fabric, and this is a complete one from England, and has the same little slot in it. That's where you put your coins into, and you can just make out the top of one of the slits there. Yeah, you might be wondering why I've got a picture of a pig there. Well, the clay that was used at the time, it was called pig. That was the Old English name for clay is pig, pug. And that evolved then into, they kept making these money boxes all throughout the Tudor, the Jacobean, Georgian period. But in the 19th century, some clever fellas said, oh, well, they're using pig for these ceramic money boxes. And he made a piggy bank. And that's where the word piggy bank comes from. It derives from the clay, the pig clay, exactly. Now, one of the really unusual things about the High Haze kiln was the fact that, as well as pottery vessels, they were also producing roof tiles. Usually roof tiles are produced in their own little separate kilns that are quite unlike your standard pottery kiln, but they were definitely producing them in High Hayes. So the kiln, seems that the potter, she would just take orders, basically. So someone would come up and go, well, I want 10 cooking pots, and I want 5 jugs, and I want 20 ridge tiles. Can you make them for me? And lo and behold, he'd produce them away. So lots and lots of these ridge tiles. They decorated the apex of the roof. There's a Victorian example of them there. Same idea. You see those. So and lots and lots. And they've got these lovely decorations on them, and some of them are glazed as well. There was an awful lot, not surprisingly, because it was a production site. There was a lot of misfired pottery. There was a lot of wasters, as they're called, and they give us a lot of information as well about the sort of technology that was being used at the time. So if you look at this piece here, can you see there's sort of these bubbles? You see those there? There's bubbles. This was a jug that was thrown. For whatever reason, there was too much oxygen, little bubbles of air in the clay. And when this went into the kiln, the bubbles expanded, and suddenly it blew. And same with this one here. This was a misfire as well. The interesting thing about this is, can you see there's a little circle of glaze. And what this tells us is that this was where the rim of another jug was plonked on top of that there, and the glaze ran, and it created that circle here. So that then gives us an idea of how these things were stacked in the kiln. You know, so we got lots of those, and it tells us that they were stacked bottoms down, one on top of each other, and because the glazes run, and they leave these very distinct shapes. So lots and lots of information from the discards. Okay, so we know a fair bit about the chronology of the site. We know a bit about, with a good understanding of the technology. We know what's being produced here. But what we really wanted to understand better was, where were they getting the very distinctive clays that they needed to produce the fine wares in particular, those lovely white and grey fabric jugs in particular. So where were they getting the clays from? And then we also wanted to figure out, how far was the pottery being sold off to? Was it just confined to Kilkenny, or was there a broader distribution? So in order to figure that out, we did a big scientific study of the pottery. This was done in conjunction with Dr. Niamh Curtin, who is in the National Museum of Ireland, and we worked with a whole range of different scientists to try and figure out all of this. We worked with local potters here in Kilkenny as well, because they told us an awful lot about where they were sourcing the clay that they were using. We talked to Nicky Moss, and we talked to people out in the Castlecomer potteries there, and we used a scientific technique called inductively coupled plasma spectrometry. I'll be testing in on all this at the end now. And then the other thing we did was a thing called petrological analysis of the pottery and the tiles. So the ICPS is basically, we take lots and lots of samples of the pottery that's being produced at High Hayes. We grind it down, and it's sent into a machine that tells us exactly what the chemical signature, the chemical makeup of the pottery is. Okay, and these are the diagrams that we get, and you can see here, these are all the chemical elements, and the longer ones are the ones that are the most prominent within the samples. So this tells us that there's it gives us a very, very particular chemical signature for the pottery that's being produced there. And what we can do then is we can try and match that with the chemical signature, which is produced using the same ICPS technique on the raw clay samples that we had taken. So we went out to Castlecomer, we went out to Sandsford's Court, we went to Cahir, we went to all these places where we had been tipped off that there was clay sources available by the local potters. We also had historical references to clay pits in particular areas, so we sampled those as well, and we tried to match them basically. So where we had a good chemical signature for the high haze ware, and we went and we matched it with the Cahir sample. We thought that Cahir would be a good one because there's lots of historical references to this lovely white firing clay being sourced in Cahir, but no, it was completely different. And what we did find though was that the potters, here's High Haze down here, and this is just a map that shows the quaternary geology of Kilkenny. And what the potters were doing was we got an exact match up here in Castlecomer. Yeah, in the banks of the Dynan River, there's clay samples that we took and that was eroding out. Probably, my guess is that they were, you know the way you've got all the coal seams up there in Castlecomer. Well, there's a particular white firing clay that covers the coal seams. Now that's generally at a very deep depth below ground, but I think a lot of it must have been eroding out of the banks of the river as well in Castlecomer, and so that clay, that coal seam clay, is what they were using. That was where the bulk of the clay that was fired in the High Haze Killins. That's where it was sourced from, based on our scientific analysis. There was, to a lesser extent then, there was clay pits out here, Sandsford's Court, which is closer to Kilkenny. That's kind of the secondary source. What was really surprising to us though was that they weren't using clay from where you'd expect them to be getting it, which would be the banks of the River Nore. There's a lake just up the road as well in the Roach Pond. No, they weren't using that clay at all, because we did take samples from that, but there was no match. So they're going all the way to Castlecomer, you know, with their horse and cart, loading it up with this particular clay, bringing it all the way back down to Kilkenny for firing in the High Haze Killins. And this is, you know, what's that, about 18 kilometres or so. This is very, very unusual in pottery production throughout the Norman world. Usually the clay pits are right beside where the killins would be set up. So the potters knew that the clay here in Castlecomer would give them that lovely white fabric, and they were very, very clear that this is what they wanted and nothing else would do. So they went to great lengths, it looks like, to go all the way up there and to get that particular clay. As regards the distribution of the pottery itself, again, the scientific analysis then allowed us to match the chemical signature of our stuff that was being produced in the killins up there with samples that we had taken from sherds all throughout the southeast of Ireland. And a lot of the time you can just match it by looking at it, you know. If you get a piece that has that very distinctive, you know, the strap handle S signature thing, you go, okay, well that's definitely High Haze. But a lot of the time what you're dealing with are just little sherds of the pottery, and you can take a sherd from Meath, County Meath, locally produced pottery in County Meath, and in the hand it's almost identical to the typical stuff from, say, Dublin. But the High Haze ware is distinctive in that it has that particular reduced wear fabric. And what we were able to do was just by matching the chemical signature with a whole series, I think we took maybe 200 or so samples from excavation sites all around the southeast, and we were able to figure out a distribution of it we got it all the way down in Dunbrody Abbey. That's the furthest away, 70 kilometres away from Kilkenny, and it's been recorded now on about 30 different sites in the southeast region. So it's got a very, very broad distribution for a locally produced type of pottery. It's very, very broad, and again that is very uncharacteristic. So that's telling us that they're making something fairly special over there that is much sought after in the southeast. And not surprisingly, most of it is found in the city itself. It's pretty much all over the place. It's very hard to say that there's any kind of social stratigraphy in the distribution of the ware in the city. So it's found on tenement plots, but it's also found on the high status burgage plots as well, like here on Roth House. Just some of the sites. There's the Roth House. Found lots of it in the garden here when we were excavating, and then I mentioned earlier on the cesspit outside the door there it is here. That's it under excavation, so good bit of it there. Quite a bit at Kilkenny Castle as well. We found some in our excavations on the gatehouse of the castle here, but the key discovery was Ben Murtagh excavated there was a big stone lined pit in the middle of the parade tower here, and it looks like all of the vessels from the kitchen. There was a big clearance event, and all the material from the kitchens at the time in the 14th century was basically chucked into this pit in the middle of the parade tower. So there's about 3,500 shards of high Hazeware pottery in all sorts of lovely forms, mostly the high-end jugs and so forth, in that particular waste pit in the parade tower. So you've got the Lords of Kilkenny, the Lords of Leinster are using high Hazeware, and you've got a whole series of other different social classes also using it. So the distribution of it, as I said, is going all the way from Kilkenny down to Dunbrody Abbey, and what links them all together is the river systems. So it's been traded down the River Nore, down to New Ross, it's probably been marketed here, and then it's going out again then from New Ross down to Dunbrody. I think it might be down in Tintern Abbey as well. Now we weren't able to get, we got a quite close match with Tintern, but we're not 100% certain. The one place I'd suspect there's loads of it is Waterford, but we didn't. That's still work that needs to be done, is to try and figure out, is it actually in Waterford through the scientific analysis. There's certainly lots of shards of pottery from the Waterford excavations that looks like it is high Hazeware, but it hasn't been definitively identified yet. So big wide distribution. In the hinterland of the medieval town, it's occurring in places like this. This is Leggett's Rath East. This was excavated by Emma actually back in 2007, I think 2008, and it's a peasant's house. So this is on, the link road between the motorway and McDonald's. This was excavated in advance of the construction of that. So it's a peasant's dwelling house, and you can see there's the foundation slot for, this would have been a timber and probably wattle house, and you can just see a big long rectangular house. And there was quite a bit of high Hazeware found on this site. So this was the pottery that they were using here. There's peasants in the medieval period using that particular pottery. And the lovely thing about this site is that the peasants very helpfully left behind a few coins for us. And there was an English long cross penny of Edward the First. So that's 1202 to 1307. Bang on the money. Perfect. So that's absolutely brilliant. At Goran, then another excavation myself and Emma did back in 2006. We found, again, this is the amazing thing about archaeology. You think you know a place and then suddenly something turns up that turns everything on its head. This was a complete street which had been completely lost to time, to memory, and it was excavated in advance of a housing development there in Gordon in 2006. So metalled, big long wide street with houses on either side, burgage plots, lots and lots of these refuse pits that were chock-a-block with pottery. Lots of high hazeware was found on the in these particular pits, including this lovely jug here. And you can see there's the really nice white fabric again. And what was really interesting about this as well was that there was one particular cesspit which produced a whole series of coins dating from the late 12th and early 13th century. And the pottery that was in that particular cesspit did not include high hazeware. So again, it tells us that it wasn't being produced, probably wasn't being produced at that time. I'm pretty sure that high hazeware is first half of the 14th century. And it's all the way, as I said, it's all the way down at Dunbrody Abbey where there's been a few shards found there. So what about the potters themselves? Is there anything that we can tell from the archaeology about these people? Well, what we do have are lots of thumb prints. So they finished off their pots. They bound the strap handles to the jugs by thumbing, and then the bases of the pots, they were generally thumbed as well. And that was to allow them to sit a little bit more stable on the table. We did a little study of the size of the thumb prints, and there was two different sizes, very distinctive. There's one which is quite a big thumb. We'll say it's a man. I have no idea. It could be anyone. But and then there's a much smaller one. You can see that one there. That's much smaller. So there's definitely two different potters who are certainly finishing off the vessels anyway, and probably throwing them as well, and involved in the enterprise. Generally, pottery production in medieval Ireland and in England and further afield, it's a family business. It's a family-run, small-scale producers in the main. Now you do have exceptions like Drogheda, and probably in Dublin as well. There was a massive production centre outside the west gate of the town, or in Thomas Street around there. But there's been no kilns or anything found there yet. But those two areas seem to be on a much larger scale. So, but in general, it's organised along traditional family lines, and I think that's probably what the thumbprints are telling us here as well. Another little possible window into this was this little finger ring. Now it's a very, very small little one, and it's probably from a child, I think. And this was actually found in the firing chamber of the kiln itself. So who knows, maybe this was one of the children of the family lost their ring in the kiln itself. Because certainly from written records from England, we know that children were involved in the production of the pottery. They would have done jobs like mixing the clay, drying the pots. They might have been involved in it. So in all sorts of ways. You're going to think I can't get away from these cesspits, but I'm going to talk more about them. The cesspits really give us another really lovely window into the potters' lives. You know that thing, you are what you eat. Well, certainly we know from the contents of the cesspits here, they gave us a really interesting view into the social standing, I suppose, of the potters. The pits produced lots and lots of evidence for this thing called free threshing wheat. And free threshing wheat it's a high status bread wheat. It's not the sort of coarse wheat that is available that the poor, say, would have been consuming. Again, meat bones are telling us as well that they were eating very, very good cuts of meat on the site here. They weren't eating the leftovers, you know. So between the bread and the meat, I think the potters here would have enjoyed a diet that would have been very, very similar to what the burgesses inside the walls of the town were what they were eating. And again, that kind of contrasts very much with what we're seeing from England from this time, where pottery production and potters they're at the bottom rung of society. It's a very, very low status craft. There's lots and lots of illustrations from medieval England, and they're showing potters being ridiculed and the like. And what about the written source? Now, I've said already that there was no written records for this site. There was no written records for the High Hayes suburb in any shape or form. But we do have quite a few references to Crockers, the Crocker family name here in medieval Kilkenny. The earliest that I've come across is from 1302, and we have another one from 1305 and 1306, 1325, 1330. So these are all within our period. And William the Crocker here, who appears in 1302, he's involved in a court case. He gets into trouble. He's causing trouble on John Street, just like they do these days. And he's hauled up in front of the Burgess court. He's hauled up in front of the court again in 1306. And I'm not sure who Adam is. Adam might be his son or something. He's up in front of the court in 1305. And then there's a Roger Crocker again. He's a signature on a land transaction deed in 1325, 1326. So you've got all of these people here with the Crocker surname. The Crocker in the medieval period, as you know, it's the potter. The potter. We also have, not from Kilkenny but from places in Dublin and elsewhere, you get the surname Figulus and Plumber, and they both again are reference to potters at the time, but it's Crockers here in Kilkenny. So I would hazard a guess that William, Adam, maybe Roger as well, are our potter. I would guess it, and they're getting in trouble at that time. Now, as you go through the 14th century, into the 15th century and into the 16th century, you see the Crocker name becomes more and more common, and you can see the family is rising up in the echelons, and they're becoming very, very wealthy burgesses. They're becoming mayors of Kilkenny, and they're on the town corporation. They're starting to own property inside in the town walls. One of them is renting out the outer gate of St. John's, and they even had their own market cross as well. There was a Croker's cross at the junction of what's now the Parade and High Street. So there was a cross there. That was the Croker's cross. That was named after one of the mayors of Kilkenny who had that particular surname. So I think the Crockers. We also there's a few place names around. There's Croker's Hill as well on the far side of town there, on the Kilmanor Road, I think, isn't it? Which is, maybe there was pottery kilns there. We just don't know, because High Hayes certainly wasn't the only production site. There seems to have been a whole rake of them in the suburbs of the town where they're producing the wares before and after High Hayes. So the site is abandoned then, probably in the mid-1300s. And what we discovered basically was that abandoned, deserted medieval pottery production centre. So after it's left, they've left things like the fire bricks behind. And gradually, over a couple of hundred years, this big thick layer here of kind of lovely loamy soil develops over the abandoned pottery making site. And this is used as a kind of town dump in the later 13th, 14th, 15th century. We've got lots and lots of particularly dumps of material that came out of the Augustinian Priory of St. John's after it was dissolved in 1540. A lot of the interior of the church seems to have been scooped out and spread out on top of the abandoned pottery production centre. Production of pottery in Ireland as well dies out at this time. And even they're not even importing very much into the country as well. There's some stuff coming in from Spain, the west of England as well, but it's not recovering until the 18th century, and there's always just been this mystery, I suppose, about what exactly is it that caused ceramic making to suddenly fall off a cliff, around this time in the later 14th century. And in Ireland, that's very different to what's happening in England. In England, production, it dissipates a little bit, but it still continues. Whereas in Ireland, we have effectively a black hole. There is some low-level production going on, and we get this transitional ware pottery, which is becoming more and more identified, but there's very, very little of that. And I looked at trying to using High Hayes, I suppose, as a test to try and figure out, what lies behind all of that. I think certainly one of the main reasons why production stops at this time is because it's primarily an urban industry. So if you look at this distribution map of pottery making sites in Ireland, all but one of them, all the ones that have been excavated, they're all in towns. Okay, so you've got Downpatrick here, it's just on the edge of the town. Carrickfergus is the same. And the only one that's outside the town is Carraray, and it's on a moated site down in County Wexford. And again, but it's not too far from Wexford, it's not too far from New Ross as well. So it looks like you've got a very different dynamic going on here, in that pottery making is an urban craft in Ireland, in Anglo-Norman Ireland, as opposed to in England, it's a rural craft. And what happens in the middle of the 14th century? The bubonic plague. And in the run-up to the bubonic plague, you've got famine, you've got the Bruce Wars, you've got the Gaelic resurgence, where the Gaelic tribes that have been dispossessed of their lands here, suddenly they rear up and they are attacking the Norman towns. And if you're living outside the walls of the towns, or you're trying to make a living from producing things like pottery outside the walls of the towns, you are in the firing line. And the Black Death, bubonic plague, wipes out about half the urban population of Ireland. So 50% of the population of the towns wiped out with the plague. And there's that really fabulous description from Friar Clin of the plague here hitting Kilkenny in June 1349, and he talks about the that pestilence deprived of human inhabitant villages and cities and castles and towns, so that there was scarcely found a man to dwell therein. The pestilence was so contagious that whosoever touched the sick or the dead was immediately infected and died, and the penitent and the confessor were carried together to the grave. Through fear and dread, men scarcely dared to perform the offices of piety and pity in visiting the sick and burying the dead. Many died of boils and abscesses, and I'll illustrate it for you, and pustules on their shins or under their armpits, and others died frantic with the pain in their head, and others spitting up blood. And you can see here these are plague victims that are being buried from an English illustration. And I, Brother John Klyn of the Order of the Friars Minor and of the Convent of Kilkenny, I leave parchment for continuing the work, if happily any man survive, and any race of Adam escape this pestilence, and continue the work which I have commenced. So that just gives this incredibly vivid eyewitness account of the plague hitting Kilkenny and the impact it must have had on the urban community here and in all the other towns of the Norman colony. So what happens is, in Kilkenny, the suburbs, which had developed 5 or 6 suburbs outside the town wall. You've got one here in the Flemingstown, there's one outside St. James's Gate, one outside the Irish town, and then you've High Hayes up here. They're all deserted at this time. It is just between depopulation and the calamities of the 14th century. You would want to be out of your mind to live and try and make a living outside the walls of the town. So there's mass desertion of the suburbs, and even within the walls of the town we have references to lots of waste ground. In lots of burgage plots are the burgage plots are laid to waste because of the bubonic plague. So I think because in Ireland it's an urban craft, pottery, I think that's a key thing as to why pottery suddenly stops being produced in medieval Ireland. It seems to make sense to me anyway, but there's a bit more work needs to be done on that particular issue. Back to High Hayes again. So we've got this, it's used as a town dump during the 15th, 16th centuries. The first map that we have of it is the Down Survey map from 1654, and you can see here, there's their excavation site, there's the town wall of St. John's, and it's in this little parcel of land here called the Curved Garden. And we've references from this time that there was all these gardens out there, and indeed in the excavations we found lots of nice garden archaeology as well that was in a horizon that overlay the abandoned pottery production centre. So these are furrows for horticulture and planting and so forth. In the 18th century then, the site, as shown on Roke's 1758 map here, it's waste ground on the outside of the 18th century, the Georgian town, and it's used as a pound. You see just there, see it says the pound up near the gallows. Okay, and a pound at this time was a place, it was an enclosed parcel of land that was used for placing animals and cattle that had run off, and dogs and that kind of thing, you know. So that's what it was in the 18th century. Then you have the coming of the railways, the railings. The 1848, the railway station is built, and it's shown here on the 1872 map. There's our excavation site. And there's a big rampart of earth brought in to build an embankment, basically, for the railway station. And the fantastic thing about that is that it covered over all the archaeology that we subsequently excavated on the site. And you've got this lovely view from 1861 of the railway station after it was constructed. And You can still see the lovely arcade is still there. This is all here. And our site is just in here. It's just in here. And our pottery kiln would have been just outside the entrance. Just there. So that's the story of High Hayes. And just to thank you all very, very much for coming along this evening. Thank you so much. And to say as well that the book was funded by the Heritage Council and my own National Monument Service. The excavations that we undertook there were funded by the development company that developed the McDonagh Junction Shopping Centre. And to thank the amazing excavation team who did such great work there on the site. And finally to thank Angela and Frank and Pat and everyone on the programme committee for asking me to speak to you here this evening, and Carolina, who's going to work her magic on putting all this online, I believe, afterwards, and to thank her too. So thank you. Thank you.